Okay, so we go. So yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to the AILHI Legacy for Humanity podcast. My name is Arnaud de Jorna. AILHI Legacy is an e-learning initiative based in South Africa that educates and raises awareness on pertinent human rights violations on the continent and globally by focusing on thematic areas: environmental justice, children and undocumented persons, peace and security, research and publications, through its offering leadership and mentorship programs for community leaders, activists, journalists, and scholars to develop informed and impactful decision makers. Currently, the cohort 2 Thandeka Rise Empower the Mentor to Mentor program is open, and application closed on the 17th November 2024, with no late submission being considered. Back to our podcast, we share expertise weekly on one of the 8 thematic areas of our AILHI Legacy for Humanity podcast series. The podcast focuses on the challenges faced by undocumented individuals, aiming to educate and raise awareness, particularly for those seeking refuge due to war or unrest. And our last discussion was about women's rights. So you can listen to this podcast on our YouTube channel if you have not already. Additionally, we are hosting a conference on December 9th and 10th in partnership with the University of Stirling. And now I will allow Rachael, my colleague, to present herself.
Great, thanks very much. So hi, my name's Rachael Macauley. I'm currently interning with AILHI Legacy as part of my Masters in Human Rights and Diplomacy with the University of Stirling. I've led the research on the topic of statelessness, and I would just like to start off with a fact that I've found that globally there are 4.4 million stateless people on record, although this number is estimated to be significantly higher. Now, we've already uploaded a Statelessness podcast on our YouTube channel, and today we're going to have a discussion on the realities, challenges, and solutions for stateless persons with an experienced guest speaker. We have Thandeka Chauke, who works at the Lawyers for Human Rights in their Department of Statelessness, and her work includes advocacy, research, and providing legal support to those who find themselves stateless in South Africa and the SADC region. So welcome, Thandeka, to the AILHI Legacy for Humanity podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself for us?
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for this invitation. As you've mentioned, my name is Thandeka Chauke. I am the Statelessness unit head at Lawyers for Human Rights, and I also coordinate the publication of the Statelessness in Southern Africa quarterly newsletter. And I am also advocacy lead in a new initiative called the Global Movement Against Statelessness.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks very much. And we really appreciate you coming on today and for your participation. So just to start off our discussion then, there seems to be some misconceptions on what statelessness is, what it means. I know personally before starting this campaign and the research that I've done, I didn't realise there was a difference between being stateless and being undocumented. I now know, there can be intersections, but to be stateless is very challenging and can affect people's fundamental human rights. So I just wanted to start off by asking yourself, well, what does it mean to be stateless?
Statelessness is a legal concept, and it has its definition in a UN treaty. It's a 1954 Convention on the Status of Stateless Persons, and it tells us that a stateless person is someone who's not recognized as a national of any country according to its laws. So essentially, you're speaking about a person who is a vulnerable person who is stuck in this legal limbo where they've basically been rendered invisible due to the lack of legal identity and the lack of that recognition of your connection to the state that you live in. And so I think to also understand statelessness, we have to start by understanding citizenship, because it's essentially the exact opposite of being a citizen. And being a citizen in legal terms, again, means having some sort of connection to a state that gives you particular rights and privileges, but also requires certain responsibilities from you as a resident or a national of that state. So for instance, the right to go to school, the right to access healthcare, but also civil and political rights like the right to vote, the right to freedom of movement, being able to leave the borders of a country and return back, or even being able to seek, diplomatic assistance from a particular state by virtue of you being a citizen. And so a person who is stateless, as the word suggests, has no state they can turn to for that protection in terms of rights, but even that protection in terms of diplomatic immunity. Essentially, you're locked out of what it means to be an active person in a society. You can't contribute meaningfully by working, by getting married, by starting a family. It leads to all sorts of social complications, but very personal complications as well, because what's often not spoken about is also the psychological impact of struggling with the idea or the notion of belonging. And I think socially, people can understand that, yes, I was born in this particular place, I belong to this family. But when you don't have the documentation in a world where increasingly you need to be able to identify yourself through documentation to access other services, it does lock you out in this space of despair and invisibility. So essentially, that's how I would explain statelessness. It's obviously more complicated than how I can put it, but I think it's also in looking at the stories or listening to the stories of people who've lived through this experience for you to actually understand how it's an urgent issue, a big human rights crisis that we need to pay attention to, but also how it impacts people on a day-to-day basis in such a way that those of us who are privileged to have citizenship might take for granted. Yeah, so that's how I'd explain it. In terms of differentiating it from undocumented persons, for instance, there is that tendency to conflate the two terminology. A stateless person might or might not be documented. Their status of being stateless is linked to whether or not they're recognized as a citizen. So in some states, they do have procedures through which a person can be formally identified and labeled as stateless and given a document that matches that status. And that document gives them a certain level of protection. But in other instances, well, more often than not, statelessness is actually synonymous with being undocumented. You often find that someone who's stateless is undocumented at the same time. And then to contrast this to refugees and asylum seekers is that often stateless people are born in the country that they have lived in, the only country they would have ever known, and never crossed the borders of that country. And then only a smaller percentage of the population of people that we call stateless are those you'd find stateless in a migratory situation. Refugees are not stateless in that they are fleeing persecution from their state. So they have that option of fleeing persecution from the state. But a person who's stateless does not even have a state to turn to say, this is my state. So hopefully that makes sense. And as we go on with the discussion, I'm able to elaborate more by sharing more real life examples of what it looks like to be stateless.
Thank you very much, Thandeka, and thank you to remind us the differences between being stateless and being a refugee, because sometimes it can be confusing. So now to move on policy, from my own perspective, in France, stateless individuals can apply for recognition through a statelessness determination procedure. And once recognized, they receive a 10-year residence permit that give them access to social services, basic services, legal protections, access to education and healthcare. And after several years, they can even apply for naturalization. So from your own perspective, what does it look like to be stateless in terms of policy in the South Africa or SADC region?
Yes, so in South Africa and the SADC region, it does look a bit different, Arnaud. Statelessness stems from several sources. One of those is difficulties in birth registration. In fact, we see this across the continent where we've struggled historically in terms of improving our civil registration rates and ensuring that every birth has been recorded and every person on the continent has some form of legal identity. And discrimination has also been one of the root causes, as well as a lot of application around restrictive nationality laws. And now what gives statelessness its unique character in the context of South Africa or the region is also the colonial legacy. So issues around borders and state succession. State succession is one of those primary causes that's been identified both historically and in more contemporary forms where we continue to see borders changing. But in the African context, the borders that we currently have are cause to question, from the beginning, from the first instance, because these are borders not drawn by our own people, unfortunately. And these are borders that were drawn without actually taking into account the people living in the areas where those lines were drawn. And what does that mean? It means that borders now separate people who consider themselves as one community, who speak one language, who come from the same ethnic group, who have the same customary practices. But because of the borders that have now been imposed on us, it means that you can have one family that lives in South Africa and one that lives in Eswatini. And it goes back to the question of now belonging and what does that look like in the African context. And I think this is what we actually need to continue revisiting when we are discussing statelessness in the context of Africa and solutions, because that is really the core of where the issues started, and kind of refiguring out how then we deal with aspects around free movement, how we monitor migration, and how we deal with policy from a human rights centered point of view, and not more from just like, political and economic perspectives. But I think the issue of borders is one big thing. The issues around birth registration interlinked with discrimination, as I mentioned. You see that even when we look at the poor rates of birth registration, when we interrogate it further or look at disaggregated statistics, it is the most vulnerable and marginalized children that are also being excluded from being registered. And these are children who are orphaned or abandoned. These are unaccompanied or separated migrant children that would have been forced to leave their own home countries for whatever reason. Children of asylum seekers and refugees, of undocumented migrants. So this is already a category of people who are at a heightened risk of human rights violations generally. But then those risks and that vulnerability is even more exacerbated by them becoming stateless, so being arbitrarily denied or deprived of the ability to access nationality documentation or to have their citizenship secured. And unfortunately, in the SADC region, we'll also struggle in terms of identifying who these people are. That's part of the problem, right? Because we don't know how to respond to an issue if you don't know how to quantify it. And we have been advocating for the establishment, like you mentioned in France, of these statelessness determination procedures. So at least there is some sort of mechanism through which people can be identified as stateless and then offered some sort of temporary protection, but ultimately a way to facilitate the ability to access naturalization or citizenship through naturalization down the line. But without that mechanism, it means that a lot of the people who have been identified as stateless in South Africa and the SADC region remain in this legal limbo, where even legally solutions are difficult to find unless you come to an organization like Lawyers for Human Rights, where we then have to approach courts, for instance, to get relief or legal recourse by using the judiciary or using parliament. But that adds to the challenges of identification. In the SADC region, I'll also say from the policy aspect, what is challenging is that there are these two UN treaties, the UN Conventions on Statelessness. They don't enjoy wide ratification in the region, which makes their application quite limited. They're progressive in that, firstly, they offer that definition of a stateless person. They offer a legal framework under which people who've been identified as stateless can be protected. And then they also offer to states guidance on safeguards that they can implement or integrate into their laws to reduce and prevent statelessness. But if states are not signing on to these treaties, firstly, and then if they're not dedicating political will to their implementation, then we are going to continue to see, unfortunately, children falling through the gaps and continue being stuck in the situation of statelessness. I think what it is promising is that recently the African Union has adopted a protocol to the African Charter on Human Rights on the right to nationality and statelessness in the unique context of the African Africa and its history. And I think that offers an opportunity once again for South Africa, for SADC states, and for African states to sign on to that as a solution to a solution that is being crafted or designed by Africans to an African problem. But this is not to discount still the importance of the UN conventions. Currently, I think it's only about 4 out of the 16 SADC states, either 4 or 8, but less than half who have signed on to both the UN conventions, which goes to show to you that low ratification rate. It's important for that the formal legal protections to exist, and then also for those to be executed or implemented, and in a way that we can also be able to measure progress and expect transparency from our states in that regard. Another key issue, but this is just the final one, is around back to discrimination, but also gender discrimination. In SADC, I think there's only one state left, which is Eswatini, that has in its constitution a problematic provision that deprives women of the equal right to pass on citizenship to their children as men do. And what happens in those cases is that when the father then is stateless himself, or he's unwilling to help, unable to do so, maybe because of abandonment or death or separation from the family, then you're likely to find children who of becoming stateless, but in quite a preventable way, because the mother is there and the mother is documented. But it's simply these ideas around, oh, our custom says this, our religion says this, but ultimately this is discrimination and it has harmful impacts, and it is also one of the root causes of statelessness. So from a policy perspective, that's what it looks like. It's both in law and in practice that we need to improve and to be able to address those gaps to ensure that we can end and address statelessness.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks very much. I think, yeah, as you said, there are still so many gaps, and we need to kind of understand it so we can close it. And I know the UN had just had a 10-year campaign there, the I Belong campaign, which did help over 500,000 people to gain citizenship. And it did encourage states to gather more data on statelessness, as there's so much missing. I think you kind of touched on that as well. We need to have a little bit more research into that so we're able to understand it more and be able to create remedies and solutions as well. And then just from your own work, like you said, you're kind of working the statelessness unit with the Lawyers for Human Rights. And I was just wondering if you could go into the work that you've done to address statelessness.
Yes, so at AILHI, we take a four-pronged approach to addressing the issue. The first is through direct legal assistance. So through our law clinics, we're able to provide advice or representation to persons who are stateless or those who are experiencing difficulty in terms of establishing a claim to nationality or citizenship, or even access to nationality-related documentation. And our work through the clinic is very much focused on amplifying the experiences of the people who have suffered this violation, but also in terms of working together with them in terms of finding a solution. So legal empowerment is really at the core of our approach. And based on that, from the law clinics, this is where we pick up issues that then inform our advocacy. So whether or not it's something that we need to challenge then through strategic litigation to push for law and policy reform. We have litigated several, prominent cases. For instance, currently the issue of ID blocking in South Africa, where people are being stripped of their citizenship arbitrarily through the invalidation of their documentation without due process. We've also done a constitutional court judgment that addressed the issue of South Africans born in exile during apartheid. And what that judgment does is that it also gives you that historical context of citizenship rights in South Africa and what they mean and how they're interlinked to the aspect of dignity, and how we need to interrogate this question around the borders that I was speaking about before, when you start to question who belongs and who doesn't belong. So that's also a very beautiful judgment that speaks about citizenship and belonging, and has basically established some very strong jurisprudence in South Africa. And then we also do a lot of advocacy and awareness raising. So we've been part of the UNHCR's 10-year hashtag I Belong campaign. We have also ran campaigns ourselves around birth registration, around challenging gender discrimination, and even around this aspect of due process in ID blocking. And that's really has been aimed at bringing more sensitivity to the public for them to understand what statelessness is. In the beginning, we talked about how it sounds like this very complicated legal concept. It happens more frequently than we realize, but you can only start to gather the stories when people have that heightened sense of awareness that this is a challenge and this is who is impacted. So we've been doing a lot of that, and then a lot of research in terms of trying to gather data. Unfortunately, the aspect of quantitative data rather is still challenging. So the numbers are still difficult for us to quantify, but there's a lot that has been put in terms of efforts to be able to see the populations who are at risk at statelessness and to kind of break it down in terms of the most vulnerable. So for instance, when we're speaking about birth registration and the children that we find are more often than not to go without having birth certificates, we've managed to do so more broadly in terms of statelessness by publishing reports and also drawing from the data that we collect in our law clinics. So our approach centers around advocacy for reform, engaging policymakers to address those gaps in nationality laws, raising awareness through strategic litigation and through our own campaigns. We have also now recently joined UNHCR in the new Global Alliance, which is targeted at leveraging collective action for policy reform. So this is now past the 10 years of the I Belong campaign and looking onward. What do we still need to do? What have we achieved so far, and what do we still need to do? And how do we make sure that in all our efforts, we are centering stateless persons?
Thank you, Thandeka. Thank you very much. As you mentioned, you're part of some collective actions for policy reforms at a global scale. And so here, many EU countries have made progress in tackling statelessness, but of course, challenges still persist. There are differences in national laws and procedures, especially because, like we are almost 30 countries, and so each country has a different national law compared to the EU law, compared to international laws. So different national laws and procedures can lead to inconsistent protection and different levels of recognition. And in some countries, it may need more support in implementing recommendations that can create gaps in support for stateless individuals. So overall, while international frameworks lay a solid foundation, their success often hinges on commitment and execution at the national level. So Thandeka, in your opinion, how do international frameworks on statelessness apply to the SADC region, and how effective are they?
Yes, so I would say international frameworks, based on the comment I made around the ratification status of the 2 UN conventions on SADC, are limited in that regard. So firstly, they're undersubscribed, and international law works on that basis of, let's say, states' consent to be bound. And so if states don't sign on to the treaties, it's difficult for it to apply in the first place in the domestic context. At the same time, we see that even when states do sign on and ratify treaties, there's challenges in terms of implementation, but at the same time, the enforcement mechanisms are often weak. So even the treaty bodies themselves, when they monitor in terms of state compliance and issue recommendations, we've seen that recommendations are redundant or repetitive. At the same time, states are not being held to account to say we're not seeing improvement. Let's say in the aspect of birth registration. Last time you were here, we heard from civil society that there are gaps in terms of undocumented mothers registering the babies. This is what we recommend. Simplify the birth registration process, remove any financial penalties, don't make the parent's documentation a requirement, or don't make the child's birth certificate contingent on the parent's status. And that still hasn't been done 5 years later. So I think we need to do more in terms of building very robust enforcement mechanisms, monitoring implementation, and calling for accountability where there's a lack of implementation, and then the continued advocacy around universal ratification. It's important for us to sign onto these treaties, not only because they have some very strong provisions that protect human rights, but also because they add to this issue of regional harmonization, like you were saying. In one region, like SADC, we have 16 states who all have a different approach to citizenship. Some are Lusophone, some are Anglophone, some are Francophone. But if all of these 16 states have signed on to something common, like the two UN conventions on statelessness and the African Union Convention, it can move us closer in terms of interstate collaboration in the implementation, even on birth registration, for instance, and issues around facilitating naturalization, dealing with protected situations of displacement, and strengthening your asylum systems to ensure that you're also plugging gaps there for statelessness. So I would say that the low ratification is a challenge, as well as implementation and enforcement. And then in terms of what I would propose for existing policies, if that's kind of like the next part of the discussion, because I feel like I've just been criticizing and not speaking about where we could go from here. Universal birth registration, as Desmond Tutu once said, is something that is impossible for us to ignore, but also something that is completely possible to achieve. And it has happened in other states. So we continue to advocate for plugging gaps in birth registration as a way to prevent and reduce statelessness. And it is achievable in the SADC context, I think, even globally. So we continue to talk about birth registration as one of those low-hanging fruits. Ratification and domestication, international regional treaties. I think I've gone on and on about that to ensure that consistency of around regional protections. Supporting gender equality nationality laws is not something I've been able to unpack fully, but I've described, for instance, in Eswatini, where you see a manifestation of direct gender discrimination in the law. You also see it indirectly in birth registration practices, particularly in the region, for instance, where mothers are being denied birth records from hospitals simply because you're an undocumented foreigner. Where mothers are being denied the right to register their children in the absence of the father, where they're seeing more extra legal requirements applying to women that you don't see applied to men, that are resulting in children not being documented and being placed at risk of statelessness. And then I think for me, one key point, which I hope should be kind of like the main message from everything I've said, is that it's important to engage real experiences to inform pragmatic and impactful reforms. And those real experiences come from speaking from stateless persons, but also engaging civil society to create that bridge between states and stateless persons. Because I know one thing is that the nature of being stateless makes you invisible, but also it makes stateless people scared to engage with state authorities because they are at a real risk of arrest, deportation, and all of that. But civil society then plays that important role in terms of bridging that gap, but ensuring that their voices are part of the discussions. So that's from me.
No, that's great. Thanks very much. Yeah, I was going to ask about kind of solutions and remedies, but you have certainly covered it there. With kind of various aspects you need to go into. Certainly the birth registration, something needs to be tackled, absolutely. So yeah, and then Arnaud, I don't know if you have if you want to kind of take it away with kind of closing statements and key takeaways that we've got.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we kind of address many challenges and solutions, especially using Thandeka. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of challenges. There are also discrimination, statelessness are at high risk of human rights violations. And one of the challenges is the lack of identification and recognition, as many countries do not have dedicated procedures to identify and recognize stateless individuals, leaving them without legal status or documentation. And in this manner, as you said, they cannot contribute to society. And fortunately, there are solutions. You mentioned a lot the birth registration procedure and the universal birth registration, in order to avoid marginalized children. So yeah, definitely that could be a solution for children of undocumented or stateless parents in order to prevent new cases of statelessness, because there are many parents who pass on their statelessness identity to their children, leaving them with a lack of legal protections and access to basic services. So, in conclusion, I would say that addressing statelessness is not only about legal reforms, but about restoring dignity and rights to those who are marginalized by nationality laws. We need to push for efficient identification processes, accessible pathway to citizenship, and international cooperation to ensure every individual has the legal identity and protection they deserve. Um, it is about ensuring no one is left invisible, no one is left behind or excluded from the rights and freedoms that are fundamental to a just and more inclusive society. So before we conclude, Rachael, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think what you've said there, I certainly agree with. We need to definitely take a holistic approach, I think, in kind of tackling statelessness, raising awareness as well as trying to advocate for existing policies, new policies, and alter what is out there. I know we've touched on birth registration being quite a vital one as well. I think from myself, for a closing statement, from a personal perspective, in the kind of West, I'm from the UK, there is a lack of information around statelessness. People don't understand what it is. We've discussed how it can be linked to migration and refugees, and when people hear that, I mean, I've had discussions with people and they don't know what it is. They do just assume it is something to do with refugees and people coming over on boats and this and that, and there's these negative stigmas around it. So I think we've had this tagline going through our podcast, put yourself in their shoes. And I think that's something that people really need to take on board. Understand what it is. As you kind of pointed out, Thandeka, like you really listen to the stories. You need to, the only way to kind of really understand it, or to try and understand it at least, is by listening to these stories, understanding what these people go through, and just realize how difficult it is. Like you can't do anything without everything you have to do documentation, and on top of that, most of it's online and it's getting access to that as well, which causes another barrier. So certainly I think, yeah, for a closing takeaway, I think it's just really important for you to open up your perspective, look at it from their perspective, and I think that's the kind of start, that's the first stepping stone into kind of tackling statelessness.
Thank you, Rachel. Thandeka, would you like to share one final thought with us? And yeah, just before, sorry, also, could you tell our listeners how they can follow you or your organization?
Thanks, Arnaud. I was actually going to steal yours because I like that. The fact that statelessness is resolvable. And I think it's important for us to continue saying that, because when we listen to the problem, it is a big problem. It's a scary problem. But the fact is that there are solutions, and the optimist in me, the human rights lawyer in me, believes that one day we will get to that point where we have people that don't have to suffer this indignity of living as a stateless person and having your belonging questioned on such a deep and intimate level. In terms of where people can find me, well, you can find Lawyers for Human Rights on all media platforms. Firstly, our website is www.lhr.org.za. And from there, you can then find our Instagram, and Facebook details. I am available on LinkedIn. That's where I share more statelessness related work. If anyone would like to follow the developments in SADC, I post quite a lot about that. And if anyone would like to connect on that level. But for those who are looking for direct legal assistance, on the AILHR website, you'll also find information as to how to contact us and get in touch with our law clinics if you need some advice with your specific case.
Thank you, Thandeka. And as a reminder, Thandeka will be one of our guest speakers for our end of the year conference, which will be hosted on December 9th and 10th in partnership with the University of Stirling. So we invite you to share your thoughts on the challenges faced by stateless people in your community or country. And additionally, we welcome any solutions you might have. So please drop them in the comment section. Again, thank you, Thandeka. Thank you, Rachael, for today's discussion. And you can follow us on social media for more content related to human rights issues and undocumented individuals. And this is the AILHI team signing off. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, guys. Thank you both.